Well, as I mentioned, I have been, shunned and vilified and rejected by the English-speaking religious community here in the city that I live in. And as I had mentioned last week, it doesn't really bother me that, that much or at all, really, to be honest. Good riddance is my opinion, and I really feel sorry for them, and I feel scared for them because I know ultimately what the fate is for those people who reject Torah. And yes, I said, and I mean reject Torah. If you are a rabbinical Jew, you are rejecting Torah. You are not following the Torah. You may think you are, just like a Christian may think that they're following God's will, or a Muslim might think that they're following God's will, but you are not following Torah. You're rejecting the true Torah, the ancient Torah. And of course, there's so much to say about this, and I often say a lot about it. And I'll just reiterate. Well, let's start there. So, we could dig right into these various myths that Rabbinical Jews and that Rabbinical Judaism wishes to perpetuate among the nation. And the first is that they're followers of Torah. They are not followers of Torah. If you compare the religion that they keep to the way that the greats of the Tanakh, King David, King Solomon, Samuel the prophet, whoever you wish to choose as your example, the way that they kept the Torah, then there's no comparison whatsoever. Samuel, David, Solomon, they did not put on tefillin. They did not separate meat and milk. They did not pray in a minyan 3 times a day. They did not say a blessing before eating an orange. In fact, there weren't even oranges in the land of Israel at that time. Neither were there etrogs. The etrog only arrived during the Persian period. In fact, the word etrog is a bastardization of the Persian name for the fruit, tuareg or something like this, and ultimately can trace its lineage back to China. So they did not wave a shaken etrog and a lulav on Sukkot. They did not know what an etrog was. They did not worry about carrying their keys in their pockets if there wasn't an eruv, and on and on and on and on. It's endless, right? So as I always say, I have a lot of quips, or a lot of, I don't want to call them proverbs, it's too arrogant a way to put it. We'll call them quips or statements, little slogans, statements that I've developed over the decades that I've been doing this. And one of them is that Rabbinical Judaism is the first Reformed Judaism. And there's a lot of truth to that. We have to stop. Each one of us, every single one of us, has to stop thinking that Rabbinical Judaism represents Torah. It does not represent Torah. It does not represent the Tanakh. It represents a deviation from the Torah. It represents a deviation from the Tanakh. And if David or Samuel or Elijah, who took care of the priests of the Baal, were to come back and were to see the way that the Rabbinical Judaism and the rabbis keep the Torah, I feel sorry for those rabbis. Let's put it that way. They wouldn't last very long, and that will eventually happen. There will be some kind of prophet or some leader that will eradicate Rabbinical Judaism off the face of the earth once and for all when the time is right. So we have to stop thinking. See, the rabbis and the Rabbinical Jews have convinced the rest of the nation. Actually, they really haven't convinced the rest of the nation at this point, but for a while, for many centuries, they convinced the rest of the nation that they are the representatives of Torah. They are the representatives of God, of Yahweh. They won't even say his name, but they have convinced the people of Israel and the people around the world that they are the representatives of God and of the Torah. And they are not. They are not in the least. They represent a deviation from Torah. They represent the first Reform Judaism in the history of our nation, the first deviant religion. Well, there were others beforehand, but the first major deviant religion that masqueraded itself as Torah. And that's the bad news. The good news is that Rabbinical Judaism is on its last legs. It really is. So let's go through some of the myths. In fact, so the first myth is that the rabbis and Rabbinical Judaism somehow represent Torah. They don't. Not any more than the Christians do, not any more than the Muslims do. As a good friend of mine always says, or as I always say, there are three derivative religions of Torah. One of them is Rabbinical Judaism, the other is Christianity, the third is Islam, the so-called Abrahamic religions. And if I were to rank which one is closest to Torah, believe it or not, I don't think I would rank Rabbinical Judaism first. I actually might rank Islam first, not the radical ISIS form of Islam, but the kind of milder forms of Islam that I saw when I was visiting Morocco, for instance, and Tunisia, just your average form of Islam that your average Muslim may keep, because they also have a sense of quote-unquote kosher, of clean and unclean animals. They also have a kind of a sense of a Shabbat mosque day. They take off at least in the mornings, and many other elements. And they don't have all of these bizarre distortions that the rabbis introduced to their religion. So the way we have to think of Rabbinical Judaism is it is an outgrowth of the exile, the exilic period of the people of Israel, starting with the exile by Babylon in 586 BCE. So then the Persian period. So the Persians, the main religion at that time in Persia was Zoroastrianism, and Zoroastrianism heavily influenced Rabbinical Judaism. So Rabbinical Judaism really grew out of the Persian, or to be more exact, a little bit later, the Hellenistic period. So Rabbinical Judaism is heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism, Persian Zoroastrianism. It's heavily influenced by Greek Hellenism. It's influenced by Roman culture. It's influenced by Islam. In fact, there's one YouTuber who unfortunately is a Christian, but he is very perceptive when he speaks about Rabbinical Judaism or speaks against Rabbinical Judaism. And one of the things he always points out is that the Rambam, who is held up in high esteem by most Rabbinical Jews, and actually there's a trend in Rabbinical Judaism in this day to return to the Rambam, to elevate him, basically Rambamists. The Rambam he calls the Rambam a Muslim Jew, and that's really very accurate, because what was going on in the Muslim world at this time, remember, the Rambam was born in the Muslim world. He was born in Cordoba, Spain. Then his family fled to Fez, Morocco. I was there in 2018. I've been to Morocco 5 times. I was in Fez in 2018 and saw the place. I can't remember now, but it was either the house where he lived or the yeshiva where he learned, one of the two. It's in Fez. And then eventually they left Fez and went to Cairo, where obviously was Muslim controlled at the time, and also there was a large population of Karaites. At any rate, so what was going on in the Muslim, one of the main things that was going on in the Muslim world at the time was to reignite or to revisit the ancient Greek philosophers, Plato, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, in particular Aristotle and Plato. So you had this trend among the Muslims to Neoplatonism and Neo-Aristotelianism, and that's exactly what the Rambam did. The Rambam, he tapped into that trend and essentially combined this Neo-Platonism, this Neo-Aristotelianism, this attempt in the Muslim world to revive the ancient Greek philosophers, and he did that within the context of Judaism. So this person, I won't even mention his name, always refers to the Rambam as a Muslim Jew or an Islamic Jew, and that couldn't be more accurate. So, so what we have with Rabbinical Judaism is just a derivative religion, and again, just as a friend of mine always says, just as the Christians have Jesus and the Muslims have Muhammad, so the Rabbinical Jews have the Talmud, right? Each one is a deviant derivative religion. Each one has its fetish that it is focused on, that it's stuck on. And in the case of Rabbinical Judaism, it's the Talmud, or the rabbinical writings in general. They're so-called oral law. I never ever refer to it as an oral law, or if I do, I always put it in double quotes. This is a lie by the Rabbinical Jews. They call it an oral law because there's no written record of it until essentially 200 CE when the Mishnah was written down. Of course, there's evidence of it existing beforehand, dating back to about 200 BCE, but there's no real written record of the details of the laws of Rabbinical Judaism until the Mishnah was written down. And so therefore they have to account for this gap between Moses, the time of Moses, which was 1250 BCE approximately, until the time when there begins to be a written record of Rabbinical Judaism. So say around let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say 150 or 200 BCE. So they have to count for this 1,000-year gap where there's no evidence of any of the stuff we mentioned, no evidence of tefillin, no evidence of eruv. That's where you have to have a string around a city. It's just ridiculous. It's insanity, actually, in order to carry a key out of your house. No evidence of saying all these rehearsed blessings, borei pri hadama, if you eat a potato, and so on and so forth, all this stuff and many more that we mentioned earlier. So they have to fill this 1,000-year gap by saying it was passed down orally. It wasn't passed down orally. It was invented, again, really in Hellenistic times. Rabbinical Judaism is once again really Hellenistic Judaism. The rabbis may speak with their lips against Hellenism, but they are Hellenistic Jews. A good friend of mine who might be listening right now wrote a thesis. I guess I can call him a good friend of mine, or a friend of mine at least. He wrote a 500-page doctoral thesis on the influence of Hellenism in Rabbinical Judaism, or specifically speaking about the rabbis' attitude towards the priesthood, but he touches a lot on the Hellenistic influence of Rabbinical Judaism. And one of the things he points out is that the so-called Passover Seder that the rabbis do each year, where you sit down with your 4 cups of wine and you lean specifically to the left. This is all taken from something called the Greek Symposium. You can look it up. I won't get into the details, but the ancient Greeks, after they had a meal, they would get together, they would speak philosophy, they would recline on chairs, and they specifically had to recline to the left side, to their left-hand side, just as the rabbinical halakha says for the Passover Seder. And they would have a wine master who would determine how many glasses of wine, often which was 4, would be drunk, and when they would be drunk, and what philosophy would be spoken about, and so on and so forth. So the Passover Seder, the rabbinical Passover Seder, is a direct imitation of this Hellenistic gathering, this Hellenistic tradition of the symposium. You can look it up, look up Hellenistic or Greek Symposium, and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so at any rate, so that's one of the lies. That's lie number 1, or myth number 1. So one of the things I mentioned when I advertised the study is we're going to talk about some of the myths. Okay, so it's myth number 1, that the Rabbinical Jews, that the rabbis keep the Torah. They do not keep the Torah. If you think the rabbis keep the Torah, then you have to also think the Muslims keep the Torah and the Christians keep the Torah. They don't. They keep a derivative, distorted, bizarre religion based on Zoroastrianism, Hellenism, Roman culture, Islamic culture, and on and on. Okay, all the mud that they gathered through the 2,000 plus years of exile. Okay, so that's lie number 1. Okay, lie number 2 is that Rabbinical Judaism is growing, that more and more people are coming back or returning to Rabbinical Judaism. They even have a phrase for this. This is Hosev B'Tshuvah, which literally means returning in repentance. And every so often they'll cart someone out who has adopted Rabbinical Judaism, who has Hosev B'Tshuvah, who's become religious, who's become what they call in modern Hebrew dati. And yes, there are some people who are trickling back into Rabbinical Judaism, but the general trend is just the opposite. In fact, as I always say, if you look at the trend line, go back 300 years ago, let's say before the Emancipation, before the Enlightenment, if you go back to let's say 1500 or 1600, almost 100% of Jews were Rabbinical Jews, aside from the fact that there was a large Karaite community, but most of Jews were Rabbinical Jews. And then if you follow the trend line down over the past couple of hundred years to today, now it's about 10% of the nation are Rabbinical Jews. The other 90% either is indifferent towards it or outright can't stand it. And of course, the Rabbinical Jews, religious Jews, Orthodox Jews, in their arrogance and in their myopia and in their blindness, they think that they are the righteous minority, and they actually believe that the other 90% of the nation of Israel is either misguided or outright evil. And many of these religious Jews, many of these Orthodox Jews, either believe that God is going to destroy the non-rabbinical Jews, or that they will gain power one day and take care of that themselves. This is what they actually believe, and anyone who's lived in the Orthodox world knows that this is the case. In fact, the opposite is the truth. As I've been saying again for decades, the Dati'im or the Chilonim, and the Chilonim are the Dati'im. The real non-religious Jews are the Rabbinical Jews, because they're following this bizarre, distorted form of Torah, this derivative religion known as Rabbinical Judaism. And your average Israeli, again, I live in Israel, so I can't speak for a Jew living, in, I don't know, Iowa or something like that, but the average Israeli who just lives a decent life, lives in the land of Israel, basically keeps, refrains from eating unclean animals such as pig, rests on Shabbat by maybe not refraining from all work, because the whole idea of what work and what it is and what it isn't has been distorted by the Rabbinical Jews and has pushed most Jews away from it. But we'll generally take the day off from work. We'll spend time with friends and family. Sit maybe again the typical thing, sitting in a restaurant or a cafe somewhere in Tel Aviv or something like that. I claim that they are keeping the Shabbat better than the Rabbinical Jew, who does all of these ridiculous things, such as a 3-hour prayer service, which is boring to no end, which is why in the synagogue I was part of, half the people don't even go to the prayer service. They sit outside in the lounge and they chat with each other, waiting around for the Kiddush. They're really there for coffee clutch, for social interaction. It's the only reason I was there at that, and to hear the Torah read out loud. At least they still do that in the Rabbinical Judaism. Of course, they bow down and kiss the Torah like an idol as it comes out, as it's paraded around the synagogue, but I don't want to get too off track. But the point is, your average Israeli who just lives his decent life is, in my opinion, is much closer to keeping the Torah than is a Rabbinical Jew who has added so many bizarre traditions and distortions of the law and new laws onto the Torah that they're not even keeping Torah. They're not even keeping Torah barely at all, right? Not any more than Muslims are, or not any more than Christians are. So let's get rid of this. So let's dispel the second myth. Getting back to the second myth, let's dispel the second myth that people are rushing back into Rabbinical Judaism. No, the fact of the matter is that Rabbinical Judaism is dying. It's a dying movement, and the 10% that remain, they're not the righteous minority. In their eyes, again, they're the righteous minority, and the other 9 million people, the other 8 million Jews that live in the land of Israel are, again, just misguided, tinokot shenishba'u, which I won't get into. If you know what it means, you know what it means, or outright evil, hate God, so on and so forth. That's the view of the Orthodox Jews. In fact, the 10%, are the stubborn ones who are not rejecting the traditions of their sinning ancestors, as we are told to do in Leviticus chapter 26:40, where it says you must reject the sins of your fathers and your father's fathers, and you must repent of those sins. They're sticking in the stubbornness of their heart. They're sticking to this distorted derivative religion of Torah, and they don't realize that they are the ones who are in grave danger when finally Yahweh makes his reappearance. And I'm not waiting for Messiah. That's another thing they do. They sit around waiting for Messiah. They're almost like Christians. They're waiting for a man to come back. I'm not waiting for a man to come back. I don't have daddy issues. I mean, they have some daddy issues, but I ain't one of them. At any rate, I'm not sitting around waiting for a daddy to come back and save me. I'm waiting for Yahweh, the kavod Yahweh, the glory of Yahweh, which has no physical form, is outside of space and time. In other words, for Yahweh to come back and reacquaint himself, to reconnect with humanity, the way he did, let's say, in the Garden of Eden, the way he did through Moses, through the prophets, and so on. So they're waiting around like Christians. They're sitting around waiting for Messiah. And if you want to take it to its extreme, then you look at Chabad. I heard a very interesting lecture this week in Hebrew, unfortunately, or I would share it, because I know most people here don't speak Hebrew. But the professor was talking about the influence of Christianity, of early Christianity, on Rabbinical Judaism, and one of the things he spoke about was Chabad, and spoke about how Chabad is Christianity in real time. You could see how Christianity developed by looking at Chabad, the way they spoke about the Rebbe as he was getting older, as he was approaching his death, after he approached his death, that many of them believe that he's the Messiah, that he's going to come back from the dead, or even more so, that he never died. He's alive right now up in the clouds like Elijah the prophet, or that he's actually an inseparable part of God. It sounds almost like the Trinity, right? So this professor said that if you look at Chabad, you could see the development of Christianity in real time. So let's dispel the second myth. Once again, that people are rushing back to Rabbinical Judaism. In fact, they're not. The first myth that Rabbinical Judaism, that Rabbinical Jews keep the Torah and that they're the righteous minority. They are not the righteous minority. They are the stubborn. They are the few remaining stubborn ones who will not repent and not admit the sins of their fathers and repent of the sins of their fathers and return to the Torah and return to Yahweh. And actually, the trend in Rabbinical Judaism is that people are leaving it. People are leaving it in droves. And if you look at, and I know many people, and I knew many people in the community here and in other communities around the world, the parents are terrified that their children are not going to follow in their footsteps of Rabbinical Judaism, because the children really, who grew up in Israel for the most part, or at least spent many of their lives in Israel, much of their lives in Israel, or were born in Israel, really want very little to do with Rabbinical Judaism, and the parents are trying everything by hook or by crook, kind of hook their kids, their teenage kids, especially when they start thinking independently, back into Rabbinical Judaism, and it's not working. So Rabbinical Judaism is on its last legs. I don't expect it to last for even another generation, and possibly even less. There might be some major things happening in Israel, like October 7th happened. God forbid another thing will happen, but there will be more troubles. There will be more tragedies. And I think that these tragedies, these troubles, just as October 7th was a watershed moment, I think there will be other watershed moments, and that I doubt even Rabbinical Judaism is going to last for another generation. And then this remnant, or I shouldn't say remnant, that's giving them, praising them, this remaining, stubborn minority that is sticking to the traditions which they're supposed to reject, again, according to Leviticus 26:40, to reject the sins of their fathers and return to Yahweh. They're the ones who I am not Yahweh, and I can't judge in the place of Yahweh, but I say they're in grave danger. They're in grave danger, and Yahweh is not going to be pleased with them. Again, that's up to him and what he does and how he does it, right? So that's myth number 2, that people are rushing back to Rabbinical Judaism. It's not true. Rabbinical Judaism is on its last legs. They're desperate. That's why among the Orthodox Jews or the ultra-Orthodox, they have so many children. And I always say, have as many children as you want, because you're making more Karaites. You're making more people who are not going to be Rabbinical Jews. This next generation is going to leave in droves, just as, again, follow the trend line, I always say. If you look at the trend line over the past 300, 400, 500 years, you see it goes down from close to 100% of the nation following Rabbinical Judaism to now only 10% of the nation following Rabbinical Judaism. Follow the trend line, it's going to go down to 0. Rabbinical Judaism is going to disappear off the face of the earth. The sooner, the better. Okay, let's talk about myth number 3. Myth number 3 is that the rabbis kept us in the galut, that the rabbis, Rabbinical Judaism, was responsible for holding the nation of Israel together in the exile, that without Rabbinical Judaism, Israel could not, the Jews could not have survived the exile. That is a lie. Exactly the opposite is true. If it were not for Rabbinical Judaism, the exile, I always say, would have been over 2,000 years ago. Okay, and as I've also always been saying, as I've been saying for decades now, yes, the Rabbinical Judaism or the rabbis kept us in the galut. Yes, they kept us in the galut. Galut means exile, by the way. They kept us in the exile. It's because of Rabbinical Judaism. It's because of the rabbis that the exile was so long and so bitter. It was 2,000 years long, because we continued in the stubbornness of our heart. We continued in the stubbornness of the ways of our sinning ancestors. We refused to repent. We refused to admit the sins of our ancestors, again, as it says in Leviticus chapter 26:40, and return to the true Torah, the Torah of David, the Torah of Solomon, the Torah of Elijah the prophet, of Elisha the prophet, the Torah of the ancient greats of Israel. And instead, we decided, or the Jews decided instead, to stick to their sick, derivative, distorted Reform Judaism known as Rabbinical Talmudic Judaism for 2,000 years. And so again, they do stupid things like, rip toilet paper on Friday because you cannot rip a piece of toilet paper on the Shabbat, and not walk out of the house if the Eruv is down, or not walk out of the house carrying their house key if the Eruv is down. and all of the crazy things, and there's so much, it's ridiculous. Just pop open a Shulchan Aruch, or pop open any book, even pop open the Rambam's book of Halakha, and you'll see how insane, sick and insane Rabbinical Judaism is. So the rabbis kept us in the Galut. Yes, they kept us in the Galut. If we had repented 1,900 years ago, then we would have already been back in the land of Israel 1,900 years ago. The fact that we've reduced our dependence, or we've left Rabbinical Judaism in droves over the past couple of hundred years, I think is part of the whole trend. If you look at the whole trend, if you look at what's happened over the past couple of hundred years, we had to leave Rabbinical Judaism in order for the return to the land of Israel to commence, in order for the aliyot starting in the 1800s, and then continuing with the foundation of the state in 1948 and on until this very day, where now the plurality of Jews in the world live in the land of Israel. The nation had to leave Rabbinical Judaism in order to start returning to the land of Israel, and that's why your average Israeli, who again is more religious than your stubborn Orthodox Jew who's just holding on to the sinning ways of his ancestors, your average Israeli wants nothing to do with Rabbinical Judaism. And that's why your average Israeli sitting in a cafe in Tel Aviv on Shabbat and not working and just spending time with his friends and family in a normal way, sitting there maybe with his phone, is keeping the Torah in a better way than the Rabbinical Jews, who do all of this crazy stuff on Shabbat, again, which you can look up. There are entire books that are hundreds of pages long about all the laws of Shabbat that the rabbis have invented and made up and distorted over the past couple of thousand years. Now, I'm not saying that your average Israeli keeps the Shabbat perfectly, but it's not their fault, because they've never been presented with anything except Rabbinical Judaism or complete lack of Judaism. They threw out the baby with the bathwater. If the nation of Israel were presented with true Torah, if they were presented with what you can call Karaism, you can call it, as I call my movement, Chosarim B'Tanakh. It's a play on words of Chosarim B'Tshuvah for those who speak Hebrew, who speak modern Hebrew. So if they were presented with the Chosarim B'Tanakh approach, if they were presented with the real Tanakh, then I think they would cling to it and they would flock to it, because it's not an oppressive religion. It's a religion that's full of beauty and glory and wisdom and all of the things that everyone in this world is looking for. So that's myth number three. Myth number three, that the rabbis kept us in the galut, they kept us in the exile. Yes, they kept us in the exile. The exile continued for 2,000 years with pogroms and rapes and murders and inquisitions and expulsions and holocausts because of Rabbinical Judaism, largely because of Rabbinical Judaism. Okay. And then let's go on to myth number four. Myth number four is that, here's something that you hear a lot, that if you leave Rabbinical Judaism, if you leave Orthodox Judaism, the chances of your sons or your children or your grandchildren being Jewish are diminished to close to zero. That is that's a lie, okay? The distinguishing factor as to whether your children or your grandchildren are going to be Jewish or not, or going to maintain a Jewish identity, if you even want to call it that, the distinguishing factor is whether they live in the land of Israel or not, okay? If you live in the land of Israel, we already have, some people here are already third, fourth generation living in the land of Israel, right? Let's say they came, let's say the average Israeli came in, let's say 1950 or 1955, right? So, let's say they were born in 1940 or something like that. Again, I'm just saying, taking an average example. Then they already have grandkids. They may already have great-grandkids. Most of those grandkids are still living in Israel, are very proud Israelis, are very proud of being part of the people of Israel, are very proud Jews, and maintain a Jewish identity. So it's not true. And if you live outside of the land of Israel, then there's nothing to hold you in place, okay? Then yes, whether your grandfather was an Orthodox Jew or not, then the chances of you maintaining your identity as a Jew diminish with each generation. I know that my grandfather, who was born, my father's father, who was born in a shtetl in Belarus near Pinsk, was he wasn't super orthodox, but he was, basically just very traditional kind of, Orthodox Jew, just the way anyone else would be. Not even really Orthodox, just traditional, I would say, right? And his son, my father, was less traditional or less Orthodox, but was traditional. And then myself and my siblings, so I'm the only one who ended up in the land of Israel. I am, of course, obviously still connected to the Jewish people, connected to the Torah, and my brother and my sister stayed in the United States, and they and their kids even are really not connected to Judaism or their Jewish identity or the Torah at all. So I think the defining factor is not whether you cling to Rabbinical Judaism or not, it's whether you end up in the land of Israel. Remember, there were plenty of Orthodox Jews in Europe, and their children and their grandchildren did not retain a Jewish identity because they were killed in the Holocaust. Okay? And I'm sorry to say, but I think one of the reasons that Yahweh brought the punishment of the Holocaust upon the people of Israel is, again, because of our stubbornness, our reluctance to come back to the land of Israel, our reluctance to repent of this distorted form of Judaism, this sick, distorted form of Torah known as, I can't even call it a form of Torah, this derivative religion of Torah known as Rabbinical Judaism. I wrote an article about that many years ago on my Karaite Insights website, and I think my my opinion regarding that has mostly stayed the same over these decades, and I'll just post the link, or you can go to Karaite Insights, karaiteinsights.com. It's a single word, Karaite, Insights, INSIGHTS.com. And you can look for the article called "The Holocaust That Was and the Holocaust That Will Be," and I think it kind of encapsulates these ideas. So let's get rid of this fourth myth, this myth that if you do not cling to Rabbinical Judaism, then your children and your grandchildren will not have a Jewish identity. Well, there were plenty of Jews in Europe who cling to Rabbinical Judaism, and their children and their grandchildren didn't have a Jewish identity because they were dead, because they were killed by the Nazis. And the reason they were killed by the Nazis, I'm not saying, and by the way, don't misunderstand me, I'm not saying that every person that was killed in the Holocaust was killed because of Rabbinical Judaism, but the punishment against the nation as a whole, I think largely had to do with the reluctance to come back to the land of Israel when they could have. Okay, we already had the Balfour Declaration in 1917. That's when Jews could have started to come back to the land of Israel. And they already had started coming back to the land of Israel, but really most Jews didn't want to. They wanted to remain in Europe. They wanted to remain Orthodox Jews in Europe. They believed that this is where their future was, that this is where real Judaism was, in the shtetls and in the European cities of Central and Eastern Europe. And yes, they clung to Rabbinical Judaism, and look what happened to their children and their grandchildren. They were no longer having a Jewish identity because they no longer had any identity because they were dead. Okay, so let's dispel this myth that clinging to Rabbinical Judaism ensures that your children and grandchildren are going to retain their Jewish identity. That's not true. The defining factor, in my opinion, is whether you come to the land of Israel or whether you remain in exile. If you remain in exile, yes, you're going to eventually assimilate. It doesn't matter how religious your father, your grandfather was. And if you come to the land of Israel, it almost doesn't matter how non-religious your father, your grandfather was. You're still going to have a Jewish identity. And we see this a living example that even your typical, Chiloni, quote unquote Chiloni, again, the real Dati'im, in my opinion, in many ways, but your typical non-religious Jew in Tel Aviv or wherever has a very strong Jewish identity. It's very proud of their Jewish identity. It's very proud of the country of Israel, and is very proud of being part of the Jewish nation. So that's myth number 4. Okay, so those are 4 myths that we can dispel. Let's go over them again. Myth number 1, that the rabbis, the Rabbinical Jews, love to perpetuate, is that they are the true keepers, they are the true guardians, they are the official representatives of Torah. In fact, they're not. They are about as close to Torah as the Christians or the Muslims. They are a derivative, distorted, Hellenistic influenced, Zoroastrian, Hellenist, Roman influenced religion, which has, is very only tenuously connected to true Torah. If David were to come back, if Elijah were to come back, if any of the prophets, if Moses were to come back, or Joshua, if any of these ancient prophets were to come back, and they saw the way that Orthodox Jews were keeping their version of the Torah, they would be appalled, and they might get a little bit angry, and who knows at that point what they would do. So that's number 1. Okay. In fact, Rabbinical Jews, as I said, are a stubborn remnant who refuse to repent of the sins of their ancestors and return to the Torah. Instead, they decide to cling to their Zoroastrian, Hellenist, Muslim, Roman, religion, derivative religion, just as the Christians cling to the New Testament and Jesus, and just as the Muslims cling to the Quran and Muhammad. So that's myth number one, dispelled. Okay. Myth number two, that Rabbinical Judaism is growing, that people are returning chosarim b'teshuvah in droves. In fact, the opposite is true. The parents are terrified. Their kids want nothing to do with Rabbinical Judaism. I'm talking about here in the land of Israel, especially in the United States, even more so. And even those who do remain within the Orthodox Jewish world, many of them do so just because they get practical benefits out of it. They get money if they need it. They get apartment purchased by their parents. They get a shidduch. They find a good wife, and so they stick in it not because they believe it. Those who even stick with it, not because they believe it, but because they're trapped in the cult for the material benefits. So there are many, many more people leaving Rabbinical Judaism than entering Rabbinical Judaism. Again, follow the trend line. 300 years ago, close to 100% of all Jews were Orthodox Jews. Now, 10% approximately. And again, I say to the Orthodox Jews, to the Karaites, make as many babies as you want, because you're making future Karaites. None of these kids are going to stick to Rabbinical Judaism. They want nothing to do with it. There will be some stubborn ones who will, want to follow in the ways of this distorted cult, in the ways of the cult. But the more kids you make, the more Karaites you're making. So go ahead, make more Karaites, please, because that's what's going to happen. So that's myth number two, that people are returning to Rabbinical Judaism, when in fact the trend is they're leaving it. And as I predict, within one generation, Rabbinical Judaism will be gone. It will disintegrate into zero. It will not be appropriate anymore. And I won't get into great detail about that right now, but I think the exile is going to end for the Jews, and there are going to be some major changes within Israel and within the Israeli society. So that's myth number two, dispelled. Okay. Myth number three. What was myth number three? Hold on a second. We'll look up myth number three. Oh, right, that the rabbis kept us in the exile. Yes, the rabbis kept us in the exile. They kept us in the exile with the distorted form of Judaism, with the stubbornness of the people of Israel clinging to this derivative, distorted form of a Torah-derived distorted religion, to their Talmud. Yes, they kept us in the exile. They did keep us in the exile. Yes, for 2,000 years. The exile would have been over 1,900 years ago if it were not for Rabbinical Judaism and the stubbornness of the Jews to stick to this distorted form of Judaism. And myth number four, if you leave Rabbinical Judaism, your grandchildren will not remain Jewish. Your children, your grandchildren will not remain Jewish. And we said there were many people who clung to Rabbinical Judaism, and their children and their grandchildren did not remain Jewish because they did not remain at all. They were killed. They dissipated into smoke in the chimneys of the Holocaust and in many other ways. So the defining factor is whether you come back to the land of Israel or whether you remain outside of the land of Israel. If you come back to the land of Israel and live in the land of Israel, it doesn't matter whether you're an Orthodox Jew or not. Okay, you are more Jewish and have more of a Jewish identity just by living in the land of Israel than any Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jew living in Borough Park, Brooklyn, or Golders Green, London, or whatever the case may be. So those are the four myths. Whenever you hear a Rabbinical Jew repeat these mantras, then know they are lies, and you can respond in some of the ways that I've spoken about right now, and know that they're deluded. They are tooting their own horn. They're speaking of wishful thinking rather than reality. And the fact of the matter is that we know where this is all heading. We are exiting the exile. We're returning from the Galut. We're returning back to the land of Israel, as is spoken about in so many verses in the Tanakh. And we are throwing off the sins of our ancestors. We're repenting the sins of our fathers and coming back to Yahweh and the true Torah, the Torah of Moses, the Torah of Joshua, the Torah of the great judges, the Torah of the great prophets, the Torah of the great kings, and the Torah of all great people throughout the ages, including the Karaites, who always, in their own way, tried to stick to the original version of the Torah and rebel and not get sucked into the sick cult known as Talmudic Judaism.